I was thinking about what I should say today, and my first instinct, of course, was to focus on the NBA and whether, in fact, the Chris Paul trade should actually have been voided. And I know that many of you are here because you expect me to talk about that, but I don't want to disappoint you. I will deal with that in the Q&A part of the discussion. You know, it is interesting that if you go back a year ago, we are 4 days shy of when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. 4 days shy of 1 year since he did that. It's almost unimaginable to think about the Middle East a year ago and where it is today. And in fact, had I been here a year ago today, I would have come and I would have probably spoken about Iran, the nuclear issue. I would probably have addressed the issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace. I would not have been talking about an awakening, an upheaval, an earthquake. And yet, in fact, had I been here a year ago, and if I had said to you a year ago today that I want to talk to you about the future of the Middle East, and I want to tell you a year from now, Ben Ali won't be in Tunisia, Mubarak won't be in Egypt, Gaddafi won't be in Libya. If I had said that a year ago today, all of you would have looked at me and you would have wondered what I was smoking. If I had added to that and I had said to you that, oh, by the way, the Arab League will have in fact imposed sanctions on Syria, the self-proclaimed heartbeat of the Arab nation, you would have looked at me and you would have thought, obviously you changed careers, you've decided to go into fiction writing, and fantasy, having come from California, fantasy is sort of, you've gone back to your roots. Well, here we are a year later, and it's not as if Iran and its pursuit of nuclear weapons is unimportant. Obviously it is important. It's not as if the issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace is not an issue that needs to be addressed. It does need to be addressed. But there is an entirely different frame of reference for us today, and what I want to do is talk a little bit about how to think about this new frame of reference and how it relates to Iran and also the peace issue. Obviously, the question to start with is, all right, why did nobody predict this? Why did nobody see it coming? And I want to tell you just one example of a story which I think brings to mind just how clearly, when you think about it, why nobody really saw it. I actually was meeting about 5 weeks before the Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, and obviously he didn't just set himself on fire, he set the Middle East on fire. I was meeting with a group of activists from throughout the region. There were about 30 of them. These were people who had came from Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain. They were visiting the administration, and I sat down with them. Every single one of them had been arrested. And at one point during the discussion, I said, how soon do you think change can come in this region? Now, of these 30 people, not one said anytime soon. If you think about it, nobody had more of a stake in change. Nobody had more of a commitment to change. Nobody had more of a belief in it. And yet not one of them said to me, 5 weeks before Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, not one of them said change is going to come soon. So the fact that, you know, people on the outside, in the academic world didn't predict it, people in think tanks didn't predict it, people in the administration didn't predict it, the fact that those who actually lived the region and had a huge stake in it didn't predict it, I think speaks volumes about how deeply embedded were the set of assumptions that change may come, but it isn't going to come soon. What were the assumptions that sort of guided everybody? What were the conventional wisdoms that convinced everybody that change wasn't possible soon? Well, I would identify several. One was that you had omnipresent, perceived as invincible and all-powerful security apparatuses who were not reluctant to use coercion and intimidation and unlimited brutality. These institutions, these apparatuses, had demonstrated their capacity over time. They even showed, as some talk about, a kind of resilience, a capacity to respond to what might be perceived changes, and they showed their vitality. A second assumption was that the leaders were absolutely determined to keep themselves in power and would pay any price to do so. And obviously we've seen some who have tried that. A third assumption, I think, is that the publics themselves, it's not that they didn't want to see change, but there was a kind of passivity because they looked at the weight of these institutions, they looked at the weight of the coercion that would be applied against them, and basically they were generally hopeless about whether or not, in fact, a change could come. Fourth, you had leaders who proved themselves to be quite adept at diverting attention away. They knew there was anger, they knew there was frustration, and they made us, frequently the United States, sometimes Israel, the focal point. They sought to divert attention away, and frequently they seemed to be successful in doing so. They also use what is a cause that embodies justice in the region, the Palestinian cause, as again a symbol to keep attention and interest, and they used it to divert attention away on a kind of consistent basis. Now, all of these factors seem to describe a region, at least until a year ago, that was remarkably stable. And yet, obviously, a year later, we look back and say, wow, the change is phenomenal. I mean, Rob described it as kind of an earthquake. And obviously, these assumptions didn't hold. So a lot of people have written and tried to explain right after the fact, why didn't they hold? And my own explanation for this is, first of all, it turns out there really was a revolution in communication and information. You could no longer hermetically seal these societies. The fact of the matter is that with the internet and with social media, people in this part of the world were able not only to compare themselves to the rest of the world and see how they live versus everybody else, but they had new means of communicating with each other. So they knew actually they weren't alone in feeling what they were feeling. In addition to the revolution in information and social media, the fact of the matter is you had a youth bulge. And when you look at the youth bulge and you look at the level of unemployment and you look at the level of dissatisfaction with them, and you also realize that youth generally are more mobilizable, more inclined to be responsive and to do something, at least more likely to act out. This also was a factor. I think the fact that there was a sense of hopelessness among them was a key, but I think also something else came to the fore, and that is generally there was a loss of fear. Societies that are based on coercion, that don't have a whole lot of legitimacy, they depend on fear. And when the fear factor is lost, or at least when it declines, then you're going to see a tremendous potential for change. And it isn't to say that the fear necessarily disappears, but if you look at a place like Syria, anger begins to trump the fear. In any case, the combination of fear and anger is a very powerful combination and helps to explain what we saw. One other factor is important. In places like Egypt and Tunisia, the institutions that were there to protect the regime decided it was more important to protect themselves than to protect the regime. You take all of these things together and you see what we have seen. Now, it's a whole lot easier, as we've seen, to have to replace and to remove what is, in fact, an illegitimate regime, or at least a regime that doesn't have a whole lot of legitimacy, than it is to build something in its place. And one of the things we've seen is there are certain groups that have a built-in advantage. And the Islamists clearly have a built-in advantage. One of the things that's been said by many people is, well, during this period, it was always, especially given the character of these regimes, the one place they couldn't take on was the mosque, because that had such legitimacy and credibility and authenticity, they couldn't take on the mosque. I used to have, I recall Yasser Arafat saying to me, after 4 bombs in 9 days in February, March of the year 2000, that when he cracked down, he would say with pride to me, I'm the only leader in the Middle East who's prepared to go into the mosque and replace the imams. Now, the truth is, the mosque was a place where you had the ability to express yourself, you had a kind of freedom of speech, and the people who were expressing themselves embodied a kind of capacity to state what they felt, to make it clear they would stand up. They came to embody a set of ideas that were attractive. They were in a position where, in fact, they could organize. So you have, in the case of the Islamists, a number of advantages. A, they have a focal point. B, they have an idea. C, related to the idea, is an agenda. D, more than this, they could organize, But even more than being able to organize, one of the things that they had was, as I said, a kind of built-in authenticity. They came to embody social justice because they would provide social services and social welfare. They didn't have to do it on a societal-wide basis. They could do it in a limited way. But the contrast between what they were doing and what the regimes were doing stood out. Also what they represented was a kind of purity, non-corruption. And what they represented was also an idea that was homegrown. Now compare that to, in fact, secular forces. First, they bear the stigma, but many of these regimes were secular. So there's no advantage there. Secondly, they had no real capacity to organize, precisely because the regimes were very fearful that, in fact, if they could emerge, they could actually be a genuine alternative. They came largely from the elite, and lacking a very clear, simple, unmistakable idea or agenda, their capacity to organize and represent and create a message soon was obviously not going to be something nearly as powerful as the Islamists. Now that creates the kind of context, I think, for where we are today. Now the question is, what are the guideposts? What are the kind of things that ought to be key principles or key elements to guide us as we shape responses to the context I've just described? I would identify a few of them. The first thing is, I think it's very important for us to remain humble about what we can do and how we can do it. I mean, it sounds trite to say, well, let's retain our humility, and that should be a kind of guiding principle. There are some who are out there today who are telling, at least I read them, and they seem to be very certain about what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Anybody who can be so certain, having not predicted what's happening, I would be, shall we say, a little bit skeptical about what they have to say. But that's not the real reason to retain our humility. Not because we didn't predict it. The real reason to retain our humility is because we didn't create it. We didn't write this story. We didn't create this earthquake. It didn't come from without, it came from within. And so those who are going to shape this new story, this new narrative, those who are going to shape the future in the area, they're going to come from within, they're not going to come from without. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean we don't have a big stake. We do have a big stake. We have interests in this part of the world. You know, the fact is we have reasons to continue to be concerned about terror. We have reasons to be concerned about the absence of peace and what it may mean. We have reason to be concerned about the flow of energy. We have an enduring set of interests. We have a stake. What we have also, however, are more limited means than in the past, and precisely because we didn't create this, because it came from within, how we approach this has to reflect we have stakes, we have limited means, we have to think about how we can try to affect what's going on, even while we recognize the limitations to our ability to really steer it. So the first principle is retain humility and a sense of what we can do and what we can't do. A second guidepost I would call attention to is, because we didn't create the story and they created the story, the expectations in this part of the world actually are quite high. You have publics right now who have a history of being acted upon. They have a history of being imposed upon. They have a history of being treated as subjects. They see themselves differently right now. They see themselves having a voice. They see themselves in a position where they can make demands. They see themselves having needs. They see themselves as being able to make claims. They see themselves as citizens, not as subjects. And as citizens, they want responsiveness. And as citizens, they want accountability. Now, it's easy to say it, not so easy to do it, but the fact is, having discovered a voice, it's not going to be so easy for that voice to disappear. Now, here is where it's important for us to keep, I think, very focused on principles and standards. This whole notion of accountability is very important. We ought to be, from our standpoint, we ought to be emphasizing accountability politically and economically. We ought to be emphasizing principles that relate to accountability, the rule of law, the respect for the rights of citizens, including minorities, women, the ability to maintain the space to compete so you can make demands so that you can freely organize. These are principles that are natural for us, and we should emphasize them. We should do the same as it relates to the economy. All of the emerging governments, they're going to have to deliver. All of them are going to have to be in a position where, in fact, they produce. And if they're going to have functioning economies, then again, the rule of law is very important. Property rights are very important. The ability to attract capital is very important. If you're going to have investment, you have to operate a certain way. Again, emphasizing principles that are important to us, politically and economically. Talking about standards of accountability, this is something that is very important. Now, our ability to state that and necessarily have it simply embodied and accepted in the region is not something we should exaggerate. We don't have enormous credibility right now. And more to the point, we're not necessarily seen as being all that relevant. Now, what do I mean by when I say that? I've had conversations with people from the region, and one of the things that they've said to me is, what do you know about transitions? When did you have a revolution? And it's not just us, it's some of the others in Western Europe, they're perceived the same way. But interestingly enough, when I talk to people from the region, they'll refer to Poland, they'll talk about Hungary, they'll talk about Chile, they'll talk about Indonesia. Here are, from their standpoint, transitions that have relevance for them. It's in our interest to find a way to turn into a mantra with others who have a kind of relevance and credibility. These standards that I talked about, we need to get a kind of repetition in terms of these standards of accountability, the key principles that we would believe in, and that if we have enough embracing internationally, including those who have relevance, then also these standards of accountability can become something that, in fact, those in the region will judge their own emerging governments by, which is what is going to be important to us if, in fact, we're going to see a transition that is responsive to what is of interest to us. All right, so humility, accountability. A third element is we're going to have new forces we have to deal with. We should engage with these new forces, but we need to engage with these new forces with our eyes open. I hear a lot of people who engage in wishful thinking and want to portray some of the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood as, well, maybe they're really Democrats. They're just closet Democrats. They've always been there, and that's really who they are. I would not be so quick to dismiss their ideology or their philosophy. They have a worldview. It's been developed over time. It actually, from their standpoint, is real. I don't think we should dismiss it. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean I think that everything is static. I don't think all Islamists are the same. Clearly, take a look in Egypt right now. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis are not the same. I also don't think necessarily that the Muslim Brotherhood is necessarily the same Muslim Brotherhood that I've studied in the past. I think there may be differences based on age and demographics. I think there may be differences based on countries. Before the Muslim Brotherhood, at least I looked at the Muslim Brotherhood as basically almost being an organization. Maybe it existed in different states, but you could almost ignore the borders. I don't think that's true today. I think what we've seen in these upheavals is a particularity. And I think everyone emerges in each of these countries is going to have to deal with those particularities. There's a third reason that I would say we shouldn't necessarily just view them as we might have viewed them in the past. If this was a year ago, before the upheaval, and the Muslim Brotherhood took over in Egypt or took over in Tunisia, then I might well have viewed that, they're going to treat their citizens just the way Mubarak treated his citizens, as subjects. They're going to treat in Tunisia not their citizens as citizens, but as subjects. The idea that they can just replace the regimes that have been removed and act as if they were those regimes and impose on their publics ignores that there are new social forces, there are new realities, and there is, in fact, I think, a new kind of awakening. As I said, I don't see people who've just discovered their voices suddenly deciding that they're going to do away with their voices. These are, in fact, going to be emerging governments after you have elections. It may well be the Muslim Brotherhood may not want to assume all responsibility, but having gotten the vote they've gotten, it's going to be pretty hard not, in fact, to be held accountable. It's in our interest that all these new governments would be held accountable. they're going to have to deliver jobs. They're going to have to deliver housing. They're going to have to deliver a sense of possibility in the future. And if they substitute slogans for that, it's pretty hard for me to see how that's going to work. If they seek to divert attention away, it's hard for me to see how that works. Now, of course, there's a risk. What if they can control all the means of coercion? What if they can deny the space for competition? All right, well, that means you turn the region back. It is in our interest to ensure there are counterweights. It is in our interest to ensure that those who are competing now have the ability to continue to compete. But it's also in our interest for these emerging governments, they're going to seek help. If they're going to deliver, they're going to have to find a way to deliver, and they're going to seek help from the outside. Now, again, we aren't going to have the kinds of means, the Europeans aren't going to have the kind of means that they had in the past. This is not going to be the era of new Marshall Plans. All you have to do is look at the economic situation here and in Europe, and you know that's not going to be the case. It doesn't mean there won't be resources to provide. It doesn't mean there aren't lots of ways to ensure, for example, that the private sector invests in many of these countries, where in fact, if the right kind of circumstances are created, you may well see that private capital feels that there could be opportunities there. But they're going to have to be reassured. They're going to have to be reassured by governments on the outside, like us, like the Europeans. And for us to provide that kind of reassurance, we have to see behavior. Again, I come back to the issue of accountability. I come back to the issue of standards. It's very important for us to keep our eye on how you develop those. We're going to be much more effective. It's not only us, but obviously, the more that we state these things, the more we're clear about what requires accountability, the more we have a chance, I think, to be successful as you look ahead. Now, in a place like Egypt, frankly, with all these countries, it isn't just that we should be developing standards. We also have to be clear in our messages, both privately and publicly. We have to be clear what's important to us. The fact of the matter is, we're not going to be able to dictate what they do, but they should certainly know what matters to us. They should know that fighting terror remains important. They should know that peace remains important. They should understand that if we have a certain kind of posture, if they have a certain kind of posture that belies what I would describe as red lines, they're not going to have the same kind of relationship with us, and they may not have the same kind of relationship with others. The key here is, I think, to be as consistent as we can be, to be as clear as we can be, while also recognizing that if it looks like you're trying to dictate, you're likely to produce a certain kind of backlash. So there's a balance that's going to have to be struck. But the balance shouldn't be a balance that means when it comes to issues like peace and terror, somehow we soften what are red lines and the pink lines. Those should remain red lines. Obviously, we're going to, with the Egyptians and with others, we'll continue to expect a certain kind of behavior towards Iran and towards peace. And that is a segue to my talking about Iran and peace. You're probably wondering when I was going to do it and how I was going to do it. I just did it. How does Iran look at the whole issue of the Arab awakening? Interestingly enough, the Iranians sought to take credit for it to begin with. They sought to claim that it was, they inspired it. It was their revolution that inspired it. And the reality is that for most of those in the region, this was not just hypocritical, this was laughable. At the very moment that people were discovering their voice in this part of the world, the Iranian approach was to squash any independent voices within Iran. It wasn't just that there was an inherent contradiction between what the Iranians were doing internally and what was emerging on the outside. There is also the fact that the Iranians, I think from their own standpoint, thought, all right, even if we can't sort of seize on this and somehow project our model, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. has friends, those friends are being changed, this will accrue to our advantage. Well, we haven't seen them able to take much of an advantage in places like Egypt. And I think one of the reasons they haven't been able to do that is because they've been exposed in other ways. Because if you look, their only real friend in the Arab world, at least the only state that was a real friend of theirs in the Arab world, is Syria. And what they have done to try to preserve the Assad regime in power is in effect to give license to a killing machine. Rather than being the embodiment of justice, which is now the symbol of justice, which is so important in a part of the world where the sense of humiliation and indignity is what is being thrown off. And the whole notion of establishing justice is now part of the idiom. The Iranians are identified with exactly the opposite of that. And so is Hezbollah, what has been their main proxy. They are seen in narrow sectarian terms right now. They're certainly not seen as in any way, shape, or form representing a kind of model. If anything, Iran is more discredited in the region than it has been. So they're more discredited in the region. If you look internationally, they're more isolated in the region than they have been. And if you look internally today, we are seeing the most severe internal struggle for power that has existed really since 1979, 1980, after the revolution itself took place and you went through a process of sorting things out. Now, part of the reason for that struggle for power is that, in fact, they're under great pressure economically. You know, the struggles for power become more pronounced when the struggle for resources becomes more acute. And that's what's happening right now. So what you find in Iran today is being discredited, a reality where they're discredited in the region, isolated internationally, economically under increasing stress. You know, you have the president of Iran a year ago saying he sneezed at sanctions. Now he describes these sanctions as representing the most severe economic onslaught that any country has experienced. It turns out that he didn't sneeze then, but now he has pneumonia. You have their oil minister saying they need $100 billion of investment in infrastructure at a time when we know they've lost more than $60 billion in projects that have been discontinued. They are feeling the stress, and the reality is their position is a good deal weaker than it was. All that's true, and at the same time, the one thing that is also true is that their nuclear program continues. They may not be as far advanced as they were projected to be at this point. The nature of what's happened with them is a nature that suggests that they're not able to move as quickly as they had wanted on the nuclear program. But it is undeniable that they continue to make progress on their nuclear program. Now, I am of the view that we still have time and space available to us to continue to ratchet up the pressure and to ensure that, in fact, Iran does not acquire or achieve nuclear weapons. And that has to be the objective. The objective has to be not just success in the means of putting pressure on them. The objective has to be not living with an Iran with nuclear weapons. The objective has to be preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. This is not about containment, it's about prevention. And I believe that, in fact, we still have the time and space to be able to achieve that objective. What about the peace issue? Israelis and Palestinians. Well, here again, the change we've seen in this part of the world is not a function of what goes on between Israelis and Palestinians. Nothing that has happened in any of the rest of the region right now is a result that peace hasn't been made. Now, is that a reason to suggest that it's not important to pursue peace? No. I have to say that, you know, historically, I've never been a fan of linkage. I think the last book that I wrote, actually with David Makovsky, we devoted the first part of the book to taking on the issue of linkage. I don't think linkage has ever really been something that has applied. It's never been the reason why you should pursue peace. This is a conflict that needs to be settled on its own merits. That was true before, it remains true today. Now the question is, what are the chances of being able to produce peace now? And I would say, you know, if you look at the context, this is not a context that can make one view the prospect of achieving peace soon as being a very high prospect. It doesn't mean it's not important to pursue it, but there's a reality. And one of the realities is we have what I would call a paradox. There is a huge gap psychologically, and that gap psychologically, in some ways, is far greater than the gap substantively. When I began working on this issue, I can tell you, the idea of accepting a two-state outcome wasn't taken as a given. If you look at the international community today and you look at Israelis and Palestinians, the mainstreams accept a two-state outcome. That wasn't the case in the past. But if you also look at a lot of the polling is quite revealing in terms of the psychological gap. close to 70% of both publics not only accept the idea of peace, if you look at some polls, you'll see they actually accept the same terms for what it would be to produce that peace. And yet, the same 70% also believe that peace isn't achievable. Now, that's a context that the leaders operate in. And if you look at the leaders today, you look at Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen is convinced that with this Israeli government, he can't reach an agreement. And so, because he's convinced that there is no agreement with this Israeli government, he imposes conditions on negotiations, since he's convinced that negotiations will only produce failure. You look at Bibi Netanyahu, and he sees in Abu Mazen someone who looks like he runs away from negotiations, imposes conditions for negotiations that he didn't impose on Bibi's predecessors, and he puts Israel in the corner. That's the perception. The gap between the two of them psychologically makes it very difficult to get at the substance. It's still important to try to produce an outcome of 2 states for 2 peoples, because I don't see an alternative to that. These are 2 peoples. They're not going to go away. They have to coexist. The only way they're going to coexist is in 2 states. So we still have to try to find a way to get there. You still have to try to find a way to get to negotiations, because you're not going to achieve an outcome without negotiations. There's one other factor that's new in this equation. The one other factor that's new in this equation is that Abu Mazen has made it clear for some time that he's not going to stand for new elections, but he's also now saying that he wants those elections in May. And when you think about that, what that means is you have to begin thinking about what happens in those elections and what happens afterwards. It's very important to validate a Palestinian leadership that believes in nonviolence and negotiations. Even if Abu Mazen at this point is not rushing to negotiations because he thinks they can't succeed, he continues to emphasize that he believes in negotiations. And it's clear he believes in nonviolence. It is important that a Palestinian leadership remain committed to the idea of nonviolence and negotiations. You have Salam Fayyad, who's engaged in institution and state building. Many of his critics say he makes occupation acceptable. That's not what he's about. He's a Palestinian nationalist. You want to validate what he's trying to do. The way to validate Abu Mazen, the way to validate Salam Fayyad, is to demonstrate that the occupation is actually receding. Now, how do you do that? Even in a context where you still are trying to get to negotiations, one of the ways to demonstrate that the occupation is receding, not being made acceptable, and therefore one of the ways to validate those who believe in nonviolence, negotiations, and coexistence is to ensure, for example, that in Area B, where there is a limited Palestinian police presence, you increase the Palestinian police presence. Talk to members of the IDF and they'll tell you that the Palestinians are doing what they should be doing from a security standpoint. So increase the security presence in Area B. Area C, which represents 60% of the West Bank, the Palestinians have almost no economic access to. You want to demonstrate the occupation is receding? Allow the Palestinians to begin to act economically, have access economically in Area C. This will actually demonstrate not just that mobility has changed, this will demonstrate that something is actually changing as it relates to the occupation. It'll demonstrate that independence can actually be achieved. It'll demonstrate that statehood can be achieved through a process. You still have to have negotiations. In the near term, it's important to validate those Palestinians who believe, as I said, in nonviolence, coexistence, and negotiations. That's an American interest, that's an Israeli interest, and I would submit that's a Palestinian interest. I would point out to one other thing, which I also think is an Israeli interest, especially in the context of the Arab awakening. Israel is obviously going to be dealing with what is a new region and a lot of different kinds of leaderships. There are many in Israel who look at this and say, now's not the time to do anything. Wait, let things clarify. When you sit back, you wait and you let things clarify, you're acted upon. When you sit back, wait and let things clarify, your options shrink. They don't expand. From an Israeli standpoint, today the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not, as I said, a focal point of what's going on in the Arab world. But you're going to have new leaderships. And those new leaderships should look at Israel a certain way. It is not in Israel's interest to have new leaderships in the area look at Israel and identify it with a source of injustice. Again, one of the reasons to validate the idea of those who believe in nonviolence and coexistence. One of the reasons to demonstrate that occupation is receding is for Israel to demonstrate that, in fact, it's not associated with a cause or a sign of injustice. That isn't going to change things in the near future necessarily in the region as a whole, but it will affect, I think, Israel's relationship to this region as it changes over time. And the one thing we know is we don't know where that change is going to be, but we know it's going to continue to unfold.